What's an educated mama?
Hello, I'm Ryan Jordan, and welcome to The Educated Mama. During this podcast, we will learn from experts, entrepreneurs, creators, and leaders who are also mothers responsible for all the things. Let's celebrate women, learn a few mom hacks, and discuss the beautiful mess of motherhood. We're all learning together, right? Mara Koffmann graduated magna cum laude from New York University with a bachelor's degree in history and Middle Eastern studies. After spending a year in South America teaching English and developing her fluency in Spanish, she returned to NYU to earn a dual master's degree in childhood education and special education. Mara started her first business, Smarten Up, in 2011. After growing her team to more than 50 tutors and providing support to thousands of students, she created Braintrust. Let's meet our guest. Hi, Mara. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Hi, Ryan. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So I would just love to learn more. This is your second company. Tell me a little bit about Braintrust.
Sure. So, I spent many years working first as a private tutor and then transitioning into growing a tutoring business. And what I came to identify was the fact that as a business owner, there were so many really talented educators that didn't necessarily want to work for a tutoring company. So it was increasingly difficult to get the really high quality educators that I wanted to hire to work as a part of my team. And at the same time, also for so many parents, the cost of services through a tutoring company become inaccessible because of the fact that there is that middleman fee that's added on just to make it a really viable business. And I had my aha moment when I was actually 8.5 months pregnant with baby number 2, walking down the street. And I reached out to a former client of mine who had become a great friend over the years. Her daughter had been diagnosed with dyslexia as a 5th grader, and she had gone through that struggle of really trying to find an excellent educator to provide the support that her daughter needed. And it was through really just like dumb luck that we were able to find each other. And I ran the idea by her, and she immediately said, "Oh my gosh, I wish that I had had a service like Braintrust to make my life more simple." And so together we began building this business a little over 2 years ago with the goal of making it easier for parents to connect with certified teachers and learning specialists who have not only knowledge of curriculum and development and best practices for how kids learn, but also the expertise to be able to help the 1 in 5 kids who learn differently, whether they have a learning difference or ADHD, or they're simply struggling in school given the existing curriculum. Braintrust is a platform to make services more accessible, both in terms of the network of professionals that parents can connect with, but also more accessible in terms of the price of services, because each of our teachers sets his or her own rate. And because the educators are spread out across the country, there are also a very wide range of prices for parents to be able to gain access to really high quality educators that can make a really significant difference in their child's life.
That's fabulous. And I think during this pandemic, I know that through my company, Educated Nannies, we started a private educator program. There were so many parents working, so many children on Zoom. So I think over the next few years, we're really going to see a difference of the children transitioning back into mainstream education and needing some support. So with that being said, I'd love to touch upon the different styles of learning. I know that children all learn differently. From being a teacher and having my own children, nobody learns the same. So can you tell me about the different styles of learning?
Yeah, so you we all have really this profile of strengths and challenges as a part of our brain and how we think about the world and how we learn best. And what is true for all of us is that the more multimodal or multisensory the learning experience is, the more likely we are to learn from that instruction. However, there are certainly some people that need a visual in order to process information, or they need to be able to hear something out loud as they're reading or trying to understand material in order to make those connections. So whether it is by sound, by movement, by sight, through some type of actual physical movement, whether it's writing something down or making gestures to learn the letter sounds, things like that, the more multisensory and more multimodal we can make the learning experience for anyone of any age, but especially little kids, the more likely they are to make progress and really put concepts together in a more meaningful and memorable way.
Yeah, that's great to discuss, because I know my kids are 4 and 6, and I find that they're both kinesthetic learners. If I put something in front of them and they're able to do more than hear or see, I feel like when they're immersed in the whole experience, they'll remember it better. Or if we go on a hike and we gather something outside, they're more likely to remember that experience. So it's really important to take into consideration how kids learn and their brains and linear thinkers as well, so that's great. And obviously kids start learning even more when they start to read. So I would love to talk to you a little bit more about children learning to read and then reading to learn. It's such a beautiful process to watch.
Yeah, it's a really magical thing. And as a teacher, teaching kids how to read and unlock the magic of books is one of my favorite things to do. It's also one that can be really challenging for a lot of kids, because while our brains are hardwired for language and for speaking and for communicating orally, reading is relatively new to people in terms of development and history. We didn't start writing stories down until fairly recently in time. And so as a result, our brains really aren't naturally hardwired to read. They actually need to be taught how to read. And for some kids, that process just kind of like magically clicks together once they kind of are able to get some initial instruction in how our written code of language works. But for a lot of other kids, it takes a lot more effort and a lot more practice and a lot more instruction to be able to make that transition to translating what they know about spoken language and things that they hear to how that information translates into written words and how those words then grow into sentences to communicate meaning. So one of the things that I always try and highlight, especially for the younger set that's in that initial stage of needing to learn to read, is that the beginning of language is really spoken words. And the more that we can help kids listen to the sounds in words, whether it's hearing the beginning sound of a word or the ending sound of a word, or thinking about rhymes, or thinking about how to break a word like cat into k, at, to hear all of those sounds and then once again blend them together, the more that we're setting kids up to then make the connection between all of those sounds that they can hear and identify so clearly and the letters that represent those sounds and words, because that's really the key to becoming a confident reader and a confident speller. And so the approach of, memorizing flashcards or doing workbooks, which is so often what we see early reading instruction focus on, really doesn't touch upon that skill of connecting all of those letters and words to the sounds that are at the core of becoming a really confident reader and writer. So what I always try and highlight to parents, and even have to explain to some teachers, because this isn't always a part of our education when we go to teaching school, is that memorization can only get you so far, because we have a limited capacity for the number of words that we're going to be able to actually hold in our head and recognize automatically and be able to write automatically. But instead, if we can really build that sound symbol connection for kids, we empower them to really be able to tackle any word and any sentence with confidence, both as they have to read it and as they have to spell it. And that's really the key to that foundational reading skill. And once kids pick up on that fact, their change in their confidence is huge. And you get to see that aha moment where the light bulb goes off and they realize that they can do it because they understand how our written language works. And that's just the most magical thing in the world to see.
It truly is magical. And I love that you touched upon the difference between memorizing and actually phonemic awareness and reading. Because I remember my mom came to visit and my son was maybe 3 and he had memorized a Bob book. Mm-hmm. And she was like, he's reading. And I'm like, and I kind of walked away as a parent. I didn't want to deflate my son's excitement, but I also wanted my mom to know not to go bragging about her 3-year-old reading grandson, that memorization is wonderful. It's a way that you feel confident with fluency and everything, but there is a big difference between watching a child sound out the words or just memorizing the text from a book. So at what age do you think is the most appropriate time? I know from, birth, we're reading 20 minutes a day. We're doing all the things, probably more than that. I mean, to be honest, a lot of us sat with our babies and read, and we're just a generation of moms and dads and nannies and everyone reading. So I'm curious to know, what is the age and opportune time to introduce the actual skill of reading to a child?
So the research on that optimal age really varies. And what it boils down to is kids need to be ready and curious to learn how to read in order to be able to process and learn from the instruction that they receive. And I know that my son, who's about to turn 4, he was really curious about learning his letters and learning his letter sounds. And so I was able to follow his curiosity to help build that foundation for him to slowly but surely begin on his path to becoming a reader. But I also work with some kids who are 5 years old who are at that same stage where they're just becoming ready to make sense of this reading code that we have. So the good news is that so long as a child learns to read by 3rd grade, it doesn't matter how early or late they begin to put the pieces together, because so long as they're reaching that milestone of becoming a fairly confident reader by about 3rd grade, the long-term impact of that, quote unquote delay or lag has no impact whatsoever on their long-term academic success. It makes school easier in the short term because 4th grade is that transition from where you learn to read to learn. And it makes that transition much easier for kids. But if a child is a slow reader or a hesitant reader or a shy reader, or they're just not that excited about doing it early on in development, despite sort of the modeling or examples that they see from other kids around them, or the pressure that we might feel as parents because our child isn't as interested in books as his or her peers might be, so long as by third grade, they have a basic understanding of how to read. They're going to be in good shape long term to be academically and professionally successful.
I think you just put a whole, city by city wide of moms and dads. I think I just heard a collective sigh of relief. That's what I'm going to say, because I know that I was on kindergarten Facebook groups this year because I had a child that went into kindergarten, and so many moms I saw were like, is your child reading in kindergarten? I'm on Zoom and some of these kids are writing and reading paragraphs and my child can't even write their name, and so I was reminding parents, if your child came from a Reggio or play-based preschool, that they're not supposed to learn those academic things yet, and they will catch up. So I think a lot of parents will be really excited to hear that, hey, goal is by third grade. I know we start off with the sight words and we do all the rainbow colors for the sight words, and there's all these techniques, but as long as you continue fostering that love, I think that's the most important thing, is continuing to just have realistic expectations of what is appropriate and what is age appropriate. I think everyone, there's been a lot of flip-flopping over the last couple decades of, first it was all we want is academic learning. If your 3-year-old can't do this, then, we have these expectations. And then it was like, oh no, just let your child be little, let them play for years. And play-based learning has been proven to show like social emotional intelligence. So I think in the big picture, knowing that marker of third grade will put a lot of people's minds at ease. So thank you so much for sharing that.
And I think, for parents, one of the things that I think is so challenging as you're watching this process unfold is that none of us remember how we learned to read. None of us remember going through that process of making those sorts of connections. And the complexity of our language, we have 26 letters that can make 44 sounds, but we have 144 different patterns for making those 44 sounds, makes English an incredibly complex language for kids to have to learn. And so by recognizing the fact that, by the end of kindergarten, you want kids to have a really solid understanding of uppercase letters, lowercase letters, and the sounds that those letters make. And hopefully kids should be in a position to be able to begin to read those 3-letter words with a mix of vowels. And then by first grade, you want them to be able to graduate to 4-letter words and 5-letter words that have still short vowel sounds like I, a, and but also with an understanding that those vowel sounds can also become long and actually say their name, like A, E, I, O, and U, and sometimes Y. That is typically what kids are working on by the end of first grade, heading into second grade. And then second grade is really mastering a lot of those long vowel patterns. And then third grade is the point where kids should become more sort of fluent readers who can pick up a grade level appropriate text. And there's lots of resources online for finding what that grade level appropriate text should look like, to then be able to begin that process of learning from the books that they pick up. But if at any point along that journey from first to third grade, you're seeing your child struggle with putting together the pieces of that code, that's the point at which it's always helpful to reach out to a really seasoned reading specialist or a neuropsychologist or your child's classroom teacher to express your concerns. Because the other thing about that third grade marker is that's typically the point at which they will begin to do an assessment to see if a child has a dyslexia or other sort of reading or language-based learning disability. At the same time, that third grade level is not the best time to begin to do the intervention work that kids need to be able to overcome that learning difference at an early age. So keeping that perspective in mind as to, first to third grade being that point in time where kids should begin developing those skills to improve their confidence with decoding, which is stretching out the sounds and words, and encoding, which is matching the sounds that they hear to the letters. If at any point in time that seems to be particularly difficult for a child, that's the best time to reach out to a reading specialist to get some additional support, because oftentimes phonics isn't explicitly taught in classrooms, despite the fact that we know it really should be based on all of the research that we have. And the second that a child can begin to receive that really direct, explicit instruction in phonics, they're able to overcome any sorts of challenges that they're having with that transition to learn to read. So third grade is that really important marker, but I want to put out that qualifier that if you're seeing your child struggle with making the connections between sounds and the letters that represent those sounds anywhere from kindergarten to third grade, that's really the optimal time to reach out and try and get some proactive support in place.
Great. That's also good information to know. I want to touch upon dyslexia for a moment. So moms will reach out to me and say, should I be concerned? My child is writing their B's backwards, or their P's backwards, or they're mixing up letters in the way that they're written in G. And for me, that is part of the learning curve and growth. So can you tell me a little bit more about when a parent should be like, this is absolutely age appropriate and part of the learning process, or is my child dyslexic? So can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, I actually just did an Instagram post on that exact topic today of letter reversals, because it's a common one. And it's also one that so many parents associate with being a sign that a child has dyslexia or some other type of disability related to reading or language. And just as you said, those letter reversals are a totally natural part of the progression of mastering letters and the ways in which we represent those letters. Because if you think about what kids have to learn, there's the fact that they're seeing new symbols. There's 2 symbols that represent every single letter in our alphabet. And those symbols make multiple different sounds. And that is a very confusing thing for kids to have to understand. And the fact that we have lowercase letters like B and D and P and Q that are mirror images of each other. It's the exact same letter flipped upside down or flipped on its side. And so touching upon what we discussed in the beginning of the conversation of the fact that multimodal instruction tends to be the best way for kids to learn, simply doing handwriting practice over and over and over again is not enough to usually make those letters stick and overcome those reversals. But instead, if you can link those letters to a sound or a movement or a picture, it tends to be much more helpful for kids. So sometimes with teaching B's and D's, there's a visual you can use where B has a belly in the front. So you can imagine a person walking with a big belly, where D has a big diaper in the back, so with the long stick in the middle being the body. And that can sometimes be a really helpful visual for kids. Other times you can think of the B being a bat and a ball, where the bat comes first and the ball is attached, whereas D is a drum and a drum stick, and you've got the drum first with the stick sticking up from it. And then my favorite of all, because it also involves not just a visual, but also a movement, is if you make 2 fists with your hands and you put your thumbs up, you can teach kids to make their bed as they're trying to figure out their words. Because when you make your bed, the B comes first and they can hear b, bed. And then the D comes second in the word, and your hand will look like a B and a D. So sort of like when we teach kids that they can use their fingers to help them with addition and subtraction, I always say it's their body's built-in calculator. Their hands can be their built-in device or tool for overcoming those letter reversals. And those kinds of visuals and, again, multimodal strategies tend to be the best resource for helping kids overcome those very normal developmental challenges. Dyslexia is more closely identified with difficulty building that sound symbol relationship. So again, if a child is having difficulty in that word cat, which is such a common one that we hear when we're little, if kids are having a hard time hearing k, at, and representing each of those sounds with the appropriate letter, that's far more of an indicator that a child is having some sort of difficulty that might be dyslexia. It might also just be a lack of phonics instruction in their class. But that would be the concern for me and the concern for any parents out there. The letter reversals are normal. The sound symbol relationships should be much more of something that you look out for as your child is developing. And the one thing that I'll add to that, just on the topic of memorization, is that lots of kids who have dyslexia are excellent at memorizing words because they have very strong visual processing skills. So if you have a child who can seemingly spell like a gajillion words, but when they see a new word, they have a hard time spelling or reading it, that is also sometimes a sign that a child might have something akin to a dyslexic type profile, or simply be relying on memorization rather than phonics in order to spell. And a good test for seeing whether your child is just memorizing words versus really thinking, again, of those sound symbol relationships is to give what is often referred to as like an alien word or a made up word to see how they would spell it. So instead of giving cat or bat or hat, like you always hear, you can have your child try and spell the word zat. And if zat is suddenly hard, but cat and hat are easy, that's a really good way to identify the fact that your child might be just memorizing all of these words that are high frequency words, because younger texts tend to have very limited vocabulary. And if a child is simply memorizing all of those words, their capacity for memorization, again, is going to time out at, third, fourth, fifth grade. And as the vocabulary in books becomes more complex, and as the range of vocabulary that's included also becomes more complex, it becomes really difficult for kids to then make that transition from automatic reading to being able to comprehend what they're reading in a book.
These are great tips. I think parents are really going to love listening to this, and nannies too. I think it's really important to hear. Mara, is there anything else you'd like to add to our conversation? I could chat with you about this all day long.
I really love being able to provide this kind of context for learning for families, because I think that's the thing. It's so hard being a parent and not remembering all of these steps that you had to go through in this process of becoming a learner. And part of the reason why we built Braintrust is to provide families with really a dedicated expert who can be their ally and their support system in this journey. And so, for any parents out there who are concerned about their child's learning, or just feel like their daughter or son needs a little bit of extra support through this very challenging year that so many of us have struggled through, both as parents and as kids, having to transition online and offline throughout the year. I hope that Braintrust can be a really great resource to you, and you can find us at braintrusttutors.com. And we have a team of experts that are here to support you with anything that you need along this journey.
Well, thank you so much for all of your information, insight, Mara. I really appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening today. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode and you had some great aha moments. I am so passionate about empowering women, and I can't thank you enough for your support. If you know an inspiring mama or you are an inspiring mama, send them our way. Be sure to tune in every Wednesday, and please like, follow, and subscribe to The Educated Mama. Write a review, leave us a comment, share this podcast with your friends. I'm Ryan Jordan, founder and CEO of Educated Nannies. You got this, mama.